Hi, everybody. My name is Alexis, and we're going to talk about hunting for the next Supercell. So basically, my background is I'm a game studio founder. I founded a company called the Republic Labs that I then sold to Stillfront, where I'm the group chief operating officer. And we're basically an alliance of 12 studios. We're quoted on the Stockholm stock market. We make about 200 million in revenues, 50 million profit. So we're a mid-sized studio, European studio. And what we do is we basically acquire several studios. Yes, you want me to? I'm also a venture partner at a firm called Atomico, which basically invests in many internet startups and also game studios. And some of the investments that we're famous for are Supercell, which has done games like Clash of Clans or Clash Royale that maybe some of you have played. Also Rovio, which has done Angry Birds. And more recently, we've also invested in Bonte Studios, Tea Time, and OBB. And I'm also an angel investor, so I've invested in about half a dozen companies per year personally, and quite a few studios as well. So I have a nice 360 view of what people look for when they're investing at seed, because I invest in angel, what people are looking when they invest at scale, because as a venture partner at Atomico, I do like the bigger 5 to 15 million checks. And then what people want to buy, because with Stillfront, we're buying 2 or 3 studios every year. The last studio that we acquired is a studio called Kixeye, that maybe some of you might have heard of. So how we think about games investing and why we think this is still Europe's hidden gem. So first of all, it's a huge market. It's a super interesting market. Actually, I really don't like being behind this thing. So let me see if I can just take the mic and go here. Does that work? Yes. Yes? Can you hear me? No? 1 second, please. Does this work now? Okay, okay, this is better. It's just like it feels stuck behind there. It's just, you did very well. So, I mean, huge market. Actually, the numbers have evolved since then. Depending on different resources, you're talking about 140 billion dollars market, which is the 2019 estimate. You've got huge companies that have reached incredible scale. You've got a company like King will have something like 300 million monthly active unique users. So super interesting market. And obviously the thing that's really killing it in this market is mobile. So mobile's really doing extremely well. And it's definitely the fastest growing part of the market. The second thing is platforms. Platforms really continue to develop. So obviously the mobile platform is amazing for accelerating. You've got also the messaging apps, which in particular in China are really interesting. Instant games is still in its infancy with the other apps in the Western world, but there's some really interesting scale that you can achieve that. The problem is monetization. Cloud games are coming with Google Stadia. So there's really some interesting things happening with platforms. It's also an amazing time to get exclusive deals with some of the best platforms and get some of your games funded without even needing a publisher. So a lot of stuff happening in the market that's interesting. Another thing that is really interesting in this market, when you're looking at it from an investor point of view, there's a lot of liquidity. Liquidity means, you start a company, you sell it, you make money. Right? The average time that you need to achieve some decent liquidity with a startup, first of all, you need to be one of the 1 in 10 companies that doesn't go bust. That's the first rule. That's pretty hard. And then when you're one of those really exclusive clubs, on average, it takes you about 10 years to achieve some sort of liquidity for your investors. And sometimes it's even a lot longer. In the games market, there's a lot of exits. And usually they happen faster. It can be from 4, 5, 6, 7 years, much faster. And you have all sizes of exits. It can go from $20 million to $10 billion. So we're not talking about a unicorn in this case. We're talking about a decacorn. So Supercell was actually at 2 exits. The first exit at $5 billion to SoftBank, and then it had a second exit at $10 billion to Tencent. So $10 billion is a lot of money. So investors look at that. And obviously King, did an IPO at about $5 billion. Space Ape sold to Supercell for a few $100 million. My own company, Republic Labs, we sold to Stillfront for tens of millions. So you have different types of acquisitions that happen there. And at Stillfront, we're not the only consolidator. Zynga is doing a lot of acquisitions. Wargaming is on the hunt for acquisition. But in our case, we making 2 to 3 acquisitions per year, and the size of the acquisitions we make range from $10 million up to $280 million. So quite a fair big range. And I talked about Kickstarter already. So lots of liquidity, fast returns. Basically, for Atomico, the investment in Supercell gave us more than a 10x return, so we made more than 10 times our money in less than 5 years. So that's a pretty interesting investment. We don't get too many like those, but it's a pretty good one. And here you can see kind of a comparison between game companies and then basically tech companies and basically how fast it goes. The other thing that we really like about that as an investor with games is that it's extremely cash efficient. So normally when you invest in a normal startup, so my first startup was actually an online travel company, that was a part of the founding team, is with a company called lastminute.com. It was actually one of the first unicorns in Europe when there were not many unicorns at the time. So I think there were only 2 unicorns at the time. I think it was lastminute.com and Skype. And that's a company that we sold for $1.1 billion after 6 years. But we basically never made a profit. So we kept raising money and raising money and raising money. And I think as the founders, we got diluted like crazy. I think the biggest shareholder of the founders, which was not me, had 3% of the company by the time we sold the company because we kept raising money. In games, that doesn't happen. Normally that doesn't happen. Normally you do your friends and family round, you do your angel round, then you do a Series A, maybe you'll do a Series B. Very rare that you do a Series C. So you do less rounds of funding, which is good for the founders and good for the investors. Why? Because quite honestly, if you're doing games and within the first 2 or 3 years you haven't figured out a way to make your company profitable, then you should probably be doing something else. Sorry to break the hard news. Because it's not that difficult, actually, to make money doing games if you've got the right quality, because you can generate revenue. Oops, I think I've got a technical problem with this one.
Just looking. What was the slide supposed to be?
There's quite a few more slides normally. Okay, so we just jumped some slides. Yeah? Never mind. So what's really interesting, and here I'm kind of going to focus on Europe, but obviously, you need to remember that games in Europe were not seen as a big deal until the Supercells and Rovio came up. Everybody thought that that the really big game companies came either from the US and then mostly from China. And this is just something to show you that actually there's some huge, major talent in Europe for games, and because you have an history, and that's kind of the sort of thing that you need to create here. You need to have those first successes and all that. The reason there's some major companies that came out of Europe in this kind of new generation, new wave of games, is you obviously had the initial successes of companies like Ubisoft, Jagex, Gameloft, and then King, and then Supercell. And then out of these companies, you have other kind of founders that have started their own companies. So obviously, hopefully, you'll have the same thing here in the region as well quite soon. And one of the things that few people know is that the game sector is actually a unicorn factory. I would say that it's probably the highest in tech, the highest proportion of unicorns actually come from the games industry. And all of these companies, and this is now probably, I think, 1.5 years old. All of these companies are game companies, and they're all unicorns. And some of these companies you've probably never heard of, and there's quite a few missing here. So if you just, for example, I think Paradox is not in here. I think the Polish company that does The Witcher is also a unicorn, is not in here. And I'd say every year, there's probably a few companies that basically get added to this list. So here's a quick, just a quick information about Atomico. Where I'm a venture partner. So what we do as well, which is quite important, is we work with the founders that we funded. So this is Hilka, he's the founder of Supercell. And then we work with these guys to basically help us with the new portfolio companies that we bring on board. Because we really are strong believers that you kind of need to basically help each other, and the people who have experience help the old guys. In terms of Stillfront, which is my main job, Stillfront is really quite unique in terms of what we're doing. So games are a creative industry. Creative industries work if you give people freedom. You need to have the decision making as close to the product as possible. If you look at a lot of the previous ways of the classical game companies, what they do is they're very, very successful at the beginning, and then as they grow and they become bigger, they become stuck, and then they're kind of stuck in that franchise system where they keep releasing the same game over and over and over and over with updates, because they lose that kind of unique creativity that made them special at the beginning and that allowed them to create those really special games, right? So we're trying to think, how can we create like a huge games company, but still keep that entrepreneurial side, that kind of that uniqueness. So what we did is we decided, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do an alliance of studios, and we're not going to integrate those studios. We're not going to tell to those studios, this is how you have to do things. We're going to keep all of the decision making at the level of the game teams within the studios and within the studios. And actually, I remember when I was speaking about this to Ilka from Supercell, it was saying, oh, you're doing the same thing we're doing with ourselves, where we're saying, the cells decide, the game teams decide everything they get done with the games, and then we just help them out. Except you're doing that at a bigger scale with several studios. So this is basically what we're doing. It's very hard to do, but we really think that this is a model for the future, and this is kind of, and we actually have a studio here in the MENA region, which is called Babel Games, that I'm sure some of you know. And the proof that this is a very, very successful model is, for example, in Babel Games, that's a studio that basically has grown by almost 10x in terms of revenues since they've joined Stillfront. So why again is gaming so incredible? First of all, there's 2.2 billion active gamers. So whenever you're pitching or when you're thinking about why am I doing games, why am I in this industry, and why is this industry interesting for investors, is right now, it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in Paris, in Amman, in Dubai, in London, you're building products that can be played by 2.2 billion people. You have access to that amount of people. And that is pretty unique. And that is pretty special. Of course, you need to have the skill sets, you need to have the talent, you need to have the experience, but how many businesses are there that 5 or 6 people can start, and then you have this kind of reach? So this is really interesting, is the audience reach. The second thing is the scalability, just how fast you can scale a product. So it's one thing to be able to reach billions of people, but the other kind of challenge is how can you make sure that you get a product that your product will still work when it's played by so many people. And the great news is in the games industry is like many people, you can use engines like Unity, you can use engines like Unreal, you have lots of back-end solutions to basically scale. You can use, if you're using multiplayer, you can use Photon or other engines. So there's a lot of tools out there that you don't need to develop yourselves to basically scale. And I remember when we were doing lastminute.com, one of the reasons we were losing so much money for so much time is we had to have our own server farm. You needed so many more things to own yourself to scale that you don't need anymore. So that's a big difference. Another thing is the rollout speed. You put your game on Google Play, you put your game on iOS, and other in Asia, you've got pretty much the world covered. So it's 2 releases, and you've got distribution worldwide, maybe except China. So that's that's pretty unique, and you don't need the local presence. Again, you can do everything with a 5 people, 6 people team in Amman or in London or somewhere else. That's quite unique. Second thing is the engagement potential. As you know, games are incredibly engaging. People spend a lot of time on games, and it's just pretty unique, and it's growing and growing and growing. Although it started kind of plateauing right now with the release of other forms of entertainment, in particular the popularity of things like Netflix and Prime Video, and I think it's going to continue to basically. I think the growth in the number of hours spent in games is actually going to start being challenging by these other forms of entertainment that you now have in your mobile devices. So we'll see. Monetizations, we cannot, basically underestimate the potential of in-app purchases and what that's done to the industry, and that's been transformative. Of course, there's lots of people, who are premium lovers, and they say, games that have in-app purchases are not real games. Real games are only premium games and all that. I respect that thought, but the customers don't care, and they're voting with their wallets. And their money is definitely going to free-to-play. So very, very powerful models there. And then, of course, advertising. We've all seen the wave of hyper-casual games, which, by the way, is slowing down. And that's made possible by basically the advertising revenues there. So there's lots of ways to basically monetize now beyond just selling your game for $50 or $60 or $10. The margins are amazing. I mean, if you think about it. Okay, we have to give, if you're using Google and Apple, you have to give them 30% of what you make. But still, normally, your hosting costs, if you've done your deals well, are really, really low. You've got incredibly high margins. Tell me how many businesses have gross margins of 70% or 65% on their products. And then and then basically, if you're selling in-app purchases, that sword that one of your graphic artists, developed in 2 hours, you can sell it millions and millions of times for a few cents a pop. That's incredible margins. So I think one of the people at Babel was saying, when you have a game that works, it's like having a money printing machine, and it is. It's true. Of course, you got to get there, but it's true. The another thing that we love as investors, and I love as an investor in games, is they're highly data-driven. Yes, it's a creative industry. Yes, you have to know what you're doing in terms of the experience of creating really fun games and interesting games and all that. But also you have so much data that allows you to know how it's working. What are your KPIs? What's the retention? So it's pretty, I would say, easy to assess the potential of a game and how it's doing. So that's another thing that we like. But yes, there's a lot of competition. But as an investor, we actually like the fact that it's a very competitive market, because then that means that you can see who's emerging, who's coming up on top, and that's the people you invest in. And if they manage to come out on top in a very, very competitive market, then that means that they must be really good. I'm going to skip through the metrics because you guys know this, and it changes. But obviously, as an investor, key things that we look at is metrics. Of course, they are different whether you are a casual game or a mid-core game or hardcore gamer, but we look at that. But most important, and it's always true, is teams. And teams are the critical elements that we look at when we're doing a game investment. We look obviously at technical talent as well, very carefully. And then it's very important also to make sure that we have people who are creative risk takers. I'll just stop this. So in conclusion, because I'm out of time, another big advantage that investors like to invest in things that are defensible. And the thing in games is once you're winning, once you have that huge IP, once you've got that talent that's got those 2 or 3 games that are known worldwide, when you have a Clash Royale or a game like that, then that means that you have access to the best talent because everybody wants to work for your studio. That means that your CPIs are lower because everybody knows your brand. That means that also impacts on your KPIs, that impacts on everything. So when you kind of emerge to the top, it's a very, very defensible position. And that, as an investor, that means that your investment becomes more and more valuable. So that's another reason why games are super interesting. And that's all I have time for, so thank you very much. I don't know if you have time for questions. I think we don't. No?
Probably take one question.
One question? Okay.
One pressing question.
Any questions? Yeah, there.
Can we get the microphone? Oh.
Thank you for the presentation. What kind of characteristics you are looking for development studios? If you want to acquire a studio, for example, what are you looking for?
As Stillfront or as an investor only? Both. Okay, so with Stillfront, it's very simple. So Stillfront, we are looking for studios that have teams that have years of experience, that ideally have a few games that are already launched and out there, and generating what we call basically what we call evergreen games. So games that people will play for years and years and years and years, and generating basic stable revenue. Because the reason we're an interesting investment for the stock market is we're 12 studios, we have 36 games, so we have very predictable returns. And for us to have a hit game is just a cherry on the cake. We don't need the hit game. And that's what markets and investors have traditionally hated about the games industries. They keep telling you, oh, it's just a hit-driven industry, so we can't really predict. So what we do differently is we gather together a lot of studios that already had medium or big hits, that they basically are still continuing to run. And then by basically making them part of the wider combination of studios, we increase their chances of their next games to be more and more successful, and you also give them the ability to scale the existing games that they have that are successful to being even more successful. So for Stillfront, we look for medium to large-sized studios that basically do have existing games and ideally are profitable. And we are particularly interested in genre expansion. So right now we have a lot of strategy games, and we're very interested in casual games and that are evergreen as well to kind of expand the portfolio. As an investor, great teams with a good track record and people I like working with.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.